Okay, well, today we're going to talk about Reconstruction. It should be a relatively short lecture, and then I'll let you guys go. But we're going to say, let me just ask this. What was the last thing that we talked about on Wednesday?
The last thing I have is that the Emancipation Proclamation freed zero slaves. And
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, why was that?
Um,
It's good. I'm glad you brought that up because I want us to realize why it actually ended up freeing zero slaves.
Because because it didn't, because no one was listening to it where it mattered in the South, right? No one.
Okay, so I think a better way to say that is that Lincoln's authority was not recognized in the places where he abolished slavery, and the places where his authority was recognized and there was slavery. Slavery didn't end, right? So there was still slavery in Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware, and Louisiana, which were all back in the Union, right? And the Emancipation Proclamation didn't do anything to slaves there. You guys get what I'm saying? So the purpose of the Emancipation Proclamation, does anybody remember what it really was?
To keep the British out?
Exactly. Keep the British out. Okay. Because the people of Britain were by this time very much anti-slavery, and so they um, wouldn't have been willing to commit to a war that was in favor of preserving slavery, if that's what it's about. Okay, so Lincoln deliberately made the war about slavery. Okay, that makes sense to you guys? Questions, comments? Okay, now one thing that I want you guys to understand about Americans and slavery is that over the course of the first half of the 19th century, more and more Americans came to believe that slavery was a moral evil, that it was a sin. But at the same time, people didn't recognize slaves as equals. And particularly, they didn't recognize black slaves as equals. Because from the European point of view, Africans were inferior. They were savages, essentially, right? And so white people were always uh, better suited to democracy than black people. So even though there's a growing call for abolition and emancipation in the North, that doesn't mean that there's that same call includes political rights for former slaves, right? So one way that we could think about it, it's not a good way to think about it, but it demonstrates the thinking of the time, and that is to say that we could say that animal cruelty is wrong and that we should prevent animal cruelty, but that doesn't mean that we should let dogs vote, right? You see what I'm saying? And that's the way people thought. Okay, and um, so that's the situation. Then when we come to the end of the Civil War, and Lincoln has passed the Emancipation Proclamation, and what that ends up doing is it does create a number of free slaves in the South, and these free slaves at the end of the war are following the Union armies around because they're hoping for protection from their former masters that they have deserted. Okay, and so at the end of the war, the United States is left with an enormous population of essentially refugees um, and how are they going to deal with that? And one of the strategies of the radical Republicans of this time was to create more citizens by granting citizenship to former slaves, because that would then cement their control of the federal government. You guys follow what I'm saying? So if you turn the slaves into voters in places like Mississippi and Alabama, right, Georgia, then that would mean that the Republican Party could make gains in those states. And you will recall that before the Civil War, the Republican Party didn't even show up on the ballot in those states. You guys get what I'm saying? So when we get to the end of the war, the question of the big question of the war, which was, is the Union permanent? Can a state secede from the Union? That's been answered. But the kind of more symbolic cause of the war, slavery, is still up in the air. What are we going to do with these slaves, essentially? Okay. And that's where we go into the period known as Reconstruction. All right. Questions, comments about this?